Never try to fix people. Stop trying to fix them. I don't care how much you love them. You cannot fix a person who hasn't decided to fix themselves. And the exhausting part is, most people spend years trying anyway, pouring themselves out for someone who never asked to be rescued. If you've ever poured everything into someone who never changed, this is exactly for you. Stay. There's a truth about human change that most people learn only after years of frustrating experience. And even then, many refuse to fully accept it. People change when they decide to, not when someone else decides for them. This sounds simple when stated plainly, almost obvious. And yet it's one of the most consistently ignored truths in relationships, families, friendships, and even professional environments. Because accepting it fully requires giving up something most people desperately want to hold on to. The belief that if you just try hard enough, explain clearly enough, or love someone deeply enough, you can eventually will their transformation into existence on your timeline. Think about what real change actually requires at its foundation. It requires an internal shift, a genuine willingness inside the person themselves to see their situation differently, to want something different badly enough to tolerate the discomfort that change inevitably demands. Without that internal willingness present, nothing external can substitute for it. No matter how well-intentioned, no matter how persistent, no matter how much genuine care motivates the effort. You can present someone with every piece of evidence, every logical argument, every loving appeal imaginable, and if the internal willingness isn't there, none of it produces lasting change. It might produce temporary compliance, a brief period of appearing to change simply to satisfy the person pushing for it. But temporary compliance and genuine change are entirely different things. And the difference reveals itself the moment that external pressure disappears. This is exactly why so many people find themselves exhausted after years of trying to help someone change. They mistake temporary compliance for actual progress, only to watch the old patterns return the moment their attention shifts elsewhere, the moment the pressure eases, the moment life simply continues without that constant external push. This cycle repeats itself precisely because the change was never actually internal to begin with. It was borrowed, temporarily, from someone else's persistence. And borrowed change, by its very nature, cannot sustain itself once the source of that pressure is removed. Understand what happens when effort gets poured into someone who hasn't developed genuine internal willingness. It's not that the effort disappears without a trace. It's that the effort gets absorbed without producing the intended result. The same way water poured into sand simply vanishes beneath the surface, leaving no visible trace of having been there at all. The person doing the pouring often doesn't realize this is happening in real time. They see moments of apparent progress, brief windows where change seems to be taking hold, and they interpret these moments as evidence that their approach is working, that just a little more effort, a little more patience, a little more explanation will finally produce lasting transformation. But without internal willingness anchoring that progress, these moments remain temporary, destined to dissolve back into the original pattern once external pressure eases even slightly. This is one of the hardest realities to accept, especially when the person you're trying to help is someone you deeply love, someone whose struggle genuinely pains you to witness. It feels almost unbearable to simply step back and allow someone to remain in a harmful pattern, especially when you believe, sometimes correctly, that you can see clearly what needs to change. But seeing clearly what someone else needs to change and having the actual power to produce that change in them are two entirely separate things. And confusing these two abilities is exactly what leads so many well-intentioned people into years of exhausting, ultimately fruitless effort. The truth worth accepting, however difficult, is this. Your role was never to manufacture someone else's willingness to change. That willingness either exists within them or it doesn't yet exist. And no amount of external pressure, however loving its intention, can substitute for its absence. What you can offer is support, honesty, presence, and encouragement. Available and ready the moment genuine willingness does eventually emerge. But the emergence of that willingness was never something you had the power to control, force, or manufacture on someone else's behalf, no matter how much your love for them convinced you otherwise. Let's examine something uncomfortable but necessary to understand. The urge to fix another person doesn't always come from the place people assume it comes from. It feels like love. It presents itself as concern, as care, as genuine desire to help someone escape a pattern that's clearly harming them. But underneath that presentation, for many people, Something else entirely is actually driving the urgency. And recognizing this distinction, honestly, can change the entire dynamic of a relationship that's been quietly exhausting both people involved. Consider what actually happens internally when you watch someone you care about struggle. Their pain creates a kind of discomfort inside you, a tension that demands some form of resolution. This discomfort is completely natural. Caring about someone means their struggles genuinely affect you. But here's where the confusion begins. Rather than simply sitting with that discomfort, tolerating it as an inevitable part of loving someone whose journey isn't yours to control, many people instinctively reach for the fastest available relief, which is trying to eliminate the source of the discomfort entirely by fixing the person's situation. This reaching feels urgent, feels necessary, feels like exactly what love requires. But examine it closely, and it often has more to do with resolving your own internal tension than with actually serving the other person's genuine growth. This distinction matters enormously because it reveals two very different motivations that can look almost identical from the outside. Genuine love for someone's growth can tolerate patience. It can watch someone struggle, offer support when it's wanted, and remain present without demanding that the struggle end immediately. Because it understands that growth often requires exactly the kind of difficult season it's currently witnessing. But discomfort disguised as love cannot tolerate that patience. It needs the struggle to end, needs the discomfort of watching to stop, needs some visible sign of progress that confirms your intervention is working. And when that visible sign doesn't arrive on the timeline your discomfort demands, frustration begins building, even though the entire effort was supposedly motivated by care for the other person. This is exactly why so many attempts to help someone eventually curdle into resentment, confusion, or exhaustion. If the underlying motivation was genuinely about the other person's growth, patience would remain intact, regardless of how long that growth took to unfold. Because genuine care for someone's journey doesn't require that journey to move according to a particular schedule. But if the underlying motivation was actually about relieving your own discomfort, then patience becomes impossible to sustain, because your discomfort doesn't care about the other person's actual timeline. It simply wants relief. And when relief doesn't come quickly enough, the person offering help often becomes increasingly frustrated, controlling, or emotionally depleted, wondering why their efforts aren't producing the results they expected. This is worth examining honestly in your own relationships, uncomfortable as that examination might be. When you feel the urge to fix someone, to push them toward change, to solve their problem before they've even fully processed it themselves, pause and ask what's actually driving that urgency. Is it genuine patience for their process, willing to remain supportive regardless of how long that process takes? Or is it discomfort, disguised convincingly as concern, actually seeking relief for yourself rather than authentic growth for them? These two motivations can feel remarkably similar in the moment, but they produce completely different behaviors, and only one of them is sustainable over the long term. This isn't meant to suggest that discomfort while watching someone struggle is wrong or something to be ashamed of. It's a natural human response to caring about someone. But acting on that discomfort as though it were pure, patient love, rather than recognizing it honestly for what it often is, leads directly to the exhausting cycle so many people find themselves trapped in. Years spent trying to fix someone, growing increasingly frustrated when that fixing doesn't work, and never quite understanding why their genuine care seems to produce so much resentment instead of the connection they were actually hoping for. Recognizing the difference between the two is often the first step toward finally releasing an exhausting pattern that was never sustainable to begin with. Let's talk about one of the most quietly exhausting dynamics that can exist in any relationship: wanting someone's growth more than they want it themselves. This situation develops so gradually that most people don't even realize it's happening until they're already deep inside an exhausting pattern, pouring energy into someone else's transformation while that person remains largely passive, sometimes even resistant to the very change being pursued so intensely on their behalf. Think about what happens when this imbalance exists. You see clearly, with what feels like undeniable certainty, exactly what the other person needs to change. You see the pattern that's harming them, the habit that's holding them back, the decision that keeps producing the same painful outcome again and again. And because you see this so clearly, you naturally want it fixed, sometimes with an intensity that surprises even you. But here's the problem hiding inside that intensity. Your desire for their change and their own desire for their change are not the same thing. And when the gap between these two desires becomes significant enough, everything about the dynamic starts working against you, regardless of how good your intentions remain. Consider the mechanics of what actually happens in this situation. You push, encourage, suggest, sometimes plead, hoping to close the gap between where they currently are and where you believe they should be. But because their own internal desire for that change hasn't caught up to yours, your efforts start to feel, from their perspective, less like support and more like pressure. And pressure, applied towards someone who hasn't developed their own genuine motivation, often produces the opposite effect from what's intended. Instead of moving toward the change, they resist it, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly, simply because the change is being demanded rather than chosen. And human beings, almost universally, resist being pushed towards something they haven't internally agreed to want for themselves. This creates an exhausting, one-sided race that becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. You're running toward a finish line with tremendous urgency, while the other person, lacking that same internal urgency, remains essentially standing still, sometimes even walking in the opposite direction. And because you're the only one actually running, the distance between your effort and their result keeps widening, no matter how much energy you continue pouring into the race. Eventually, this imbalance produces exactly the kind of depletion so many people experience without fully understanding why. You've given everything you have towards someone else's growth, and yet nothing about their situation has actually changed, leaving you exhausted, confused, and often quietly resentful, wondering why your effort didn't produce the outcome it seemed to deserve. Here's what's worth understanding about this pattern. The exhaustion isn't really coming from the effort itself. It's coming from the mismatch between your desire and theirs. Effort invested in something you genuinely want for yourself, even when that effort is significant, tends to feel energizing, purposeful, worth the cost involved. But effort invested in wanting something for someone else, more than they want it for themselves, tends to feel completely different. It feels like carrying weight that was never actually yours to carry, and carrying weight that belongs to someone else. For long enough, inevitably produces exhaustion, regardless of how much love originally motivated picking it up in the first place. This is why recognizing this imbalance early matters so much. When you notice that your desire for someone's growth has significantly outpaced their own desire for it, that's the moment worth pausing, rather than doubling down on effort and hoping intensity alone will eventually close the gap. Doubling down rarely works, because the gap was never actually about effort in the first place. It was about ownership. Genuine change requires the person changing to own the desire for it themselves. And no amount of your wanting, however sincere, however loving, can substitute for that ownership being present. So the discipline worth building here is learning to notice when your investment in someone's growth has quietly exceeded their own, and choosing, deliberately, to release your grip on outcomes that were never yours to control. You can remain available, supportive, and present, but the race itself, if it's ever going to be completed, has to eventually become theirs to run, at whatever pace their own internal willingness finally allows. Let's finish with a distinction that, once understood clearly, can completely transform how you relate to the people you care about. Loving someone and fixing someone are two entirely different jobs, and confusing them is exactly what quietly destroys both relationships and the person doing the confusing. Think about what love actually requires at its core. Love requires presence. It requires honesty, offered with care rather than judgment. It requires the willingness to walk beside someone through difficulty, to encourage them when encouragement is genuinely welcomed, to remain available without demanding that their journey follow a particular timeline or destination you've decided is correct. Love, in its healthiest form, doesn't require controlling an outcome. It simply requires showing up consistently, with genuine care, regardless of whether the other person's situation changes on the schedule you might privately be hoping for. Fixing requires something fundamentally different. Fixing requires control. It requires attaching your effort to a specific outcome and measuring the value of that effort based on whether the outcome eventually matches what you envisioned. Fixing isn't satisfied with simply being present. It needs progress, needs visible change, needs confirmation that the intervention is working. Because without that confirmation, the entire effort starts to feel wasted, pointless, or even personally rejected. This is precisely why fixing, unlike love, cannot sustain itself patiently over long periods without producing frustration. It was never designed for patience. It was designed for results. And when results don't arrive on schedule, fixing inevitably collapses into disappointment, control, or exhaustion. This is exactly why so many relationships, built originally on genuine love, gradually transform into something far more strained, simply because love quietly got replaced by fixing without either person fully realizing the shift had occurred. It often starts innocently enough, genuine concern for someone's well-being, a real desire to see them thrive. But somewhere along the way, particularly when that person's struggle continues longer than expected, concern shifts into urgency, and urgency shifts into control. And before long, what began as love has fully transformed into fixing, complete with expectations, timelines, and disappointment when those expectations aren't met. The person being fixed almost always senses this shift, even if they can't articulate it clearly. They begin to feel less like someone being genuinely supported and more like a project someone else is managing, a problem someone else is trying to solve. And most people, understandably, resist being treated as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be accompanied. This resistance often gets misread by the person doing the fixing as further evidence that something is deeply wrong, prompting even more intense fixing efforts, which only deepens the resistance further, creating exactly the kind of exhausting, deteriorating cycle so many relationships eventually get trapped inside. Meanwhile, the person doing the fixing experiences their own kind of damage throughout this process. Fixing, unlike love, is inherently draining because it requires constant vigilance, constant effort, constant emotional investment in an outcome that remains, ultimately, outside of their control. Love can rest. Love can trust the process, even an uncertain one. Fixing cannot rest, because fixing believes the outcome depends entirely on continued effort, and that belief, sustained over months or years, eventually exhausts even the most well-intentioned person completely. This is why learning to separate these two jobs matters so profoundly. You are fully capable of continuing to love someone deeply while simultaneously releasing the exhausting job of fixing them. These aren't contradictory positions. In fact, releasing the fixing often allows the love to become more genuine, more sustainable, and ultimately more helpful than the fixing ever was. Precisely because love, freed from the burden of needing to control an outcome, can simply remain present, patient, and available, exactly when and if the other person eventually becomes ready to receive it. So the invitation here isn't to love less, it's to love differently, to keep offering presence, honesty, and support, while finally releasing the exhausting belief that those offerings were ever supposed to guarantee a specific result. Love was never meant to carry that particular burden. Only fixing was. And fixing, however well-intentioned, was never actually a job anyone had the power to complete on someone else's behalf. If you've exhausted yourself trying to save someone who never wanted saving, if you've mistaken your own discomfort for love one more time than you'd like to admit, comment, "Let go" right now, so I know you're ready to release what was never yours to carry. Because what I'm about to say next might be the permission you've needed for a very long time. It has to do with compounding. And compounding is a far more important concept to understand than most people ever take the time to examine. Think about what compounding actually means. A skill, once built, doesn't simply sit still at the level it was acquired. It continues to grow, deepen, and multiply in value the longer it's actively used and refined. A communication skill developed at 25 gets applied, tested, and sharpened across the following decades. In relationships, in career opportunities, in negotiations, in leadership moments that wouldn't have been possible without that early foundation. Each year that skill is used adds another layer of value on top of what was already there, the same way interest compounds on money left to grow undisturbed over time. This is exactly why the timing of when a skill gets built matters so much more than most people realize. It's not simply about acquiring the skill. It's about how many years that skill has left to compound once it's acquired. Now, compare this to the exact same skill, built for the first time at 50 instead of 25. The skill itself might be identical in quality. The person might even learn it faster, given more life experience and context to draw from. But the runway remaining for that skill to compound is dramatically shorter. 25 years of compounding produces an entirely different outcome than 5 or 10 years of compounding, even starting from the exact same skill level. This isn't a judgment on anyone who builds skills later in life. It's simply an honest acknowledgement of how time functions as a multiplier, regardless of when someone chooses to engage with it. This is precisely why the years before 35 carry a particular kind of weight that later years, however valuable in their own right, simply cannot replicate. It's not that these years are inherently more important as years. It's that whatever gets built during them has more time left to work in your favor, more decades left to accumulate value, more opportunities left to be tested, refined, and compounded upon. A financial habit built at 28 has several more decades to benefit from compound interest than the same habit built at 50. A relationship-building skill developed early has several more decades to generate connections, opportunities, and trust than the same skill developed later. The skill itself might be equally valuable in both cases. The compounding available to it is not. This is why waiting to build important skills, simply because there's no immediate pressure forcing the issue, carries a hidden cost that rarely shows up until much later. The cost isn't visible in the moment of delay. Nothing dramatic happens the day someone decides to postpone building a skill they know they eventually need. But that decision quietly removes years of potential compounding that can never actually be recovered later, no matter how much effort gets applied afterward. This is the real, tangible cost of delay. Not that the opportunity disappears entirely, but that the multiplier working in your favor shrinks with every year the decision gets postponed. So understanding 35 as a compounding cutoff, rather than some rigid deadline, changes the entire way this conversation should be approached. It's not about panic, and it's not about believing that missing this window means missing everything. It's about recognizing, honestly, that time itself is one of the most valuable ingredients in skill building. And every year spent avoiding a skill you know matters is a year of compounding that will never be available to reclaim, no matter how much urgency eventually gets applied once that year has already passed. Let's talk about something that shifts quietly with age, something most people don't fully notice until they're already past the point where it would have mattered most. The way risk gets absorbed differently depending on when it's taken. This isn't about courage increasing or decreasing with age, and it isn't about capability. It's about something more structural than that. Risk taken earlier in life gets absorbed by time itself, cushioned by the sheer number of years remaining to recover from it. Risk taken later carries a fundamentally different weight, not because the person taking it is any less capable, but because the surrounding circumstances have quietly changed in ways that make recovery far more difficult. Think about what it actually means to fail at something in your 20s or early 30s. A failed business venture during these years is painful, certainly. It can feel devastating in the moment, embarrassing, financially costly. But underneath that pain, there's usually still an enormous amount of runway left to recover. There are still decades of career ahead to rebuild reputation, decades of earning potential ahead to recover financially, decades of relationships and opportunities still forming that haven't yet been shaped by this particular setback. The failure gets absorbed into a much larger remaining timeline, and over enough years, it often becomes little more than a formative chapter in a much longer story, rather than a defining conclusion to it. Now consider that same exact failure occurring 20 years later, in someone's 50s rather than their 20s. The pain is often identical in the moment, but the surrounding circumstances have shifted considerably. There's typically far less remaining runway to rebuild financially. There are often more people depending on that person's stability, children, aging parents, established responsibilities that didn't exist during the earlier years. The margin for recovery has narrowed considerably, not because the person has become less capable, but because time itself has quietly removed much of the cushion that once made recovery relatively straightforward. This is exactly why early risk-taking deserves far more encouragement than it typically receives, and why so many people who avoided risk during these formative years later express regret about opportunities they let pass without ever attempting them. The regret rarely centers on having tried and failed. It almost always centers on never having tried at all, precisely because the risk felt too uncertain at a time when, in retrospect, it was actually one of the safest possible windows to take it. The 20s and early 30s don't eliminate risk, but but they do provide a uniquely forgiving environment for absorbing whatever consequences that risk might produce. An environment that gradually becomes less forgiving with each passing decade. This isn't meant to suggest that risk should be taken recklessly, without thought or preparation, simply because youth provides some cushion. Thoughtless risk carries real consequences at any age. But calculated risk, the kind involving genuine effort towards something meaningful, with a real possibility of failure attached to it, deserves serious consideration precisely during these years, because the cost of that failure, should it occur, remains genuinely manageable in a way it may not remain manageable later. This is also why comparing risk tolerance across different life stages, without accounting for this shifting cushion, leads to flawed conclusions. It's easy to look at someone taking a bold risk in their 50s and assume similar boldness was always available to them. But the same action, attempted decades earlier, would have carried a completely different risk profile, precisely because more time remained to absorb whatever outcome resulted from it. This is why the encouragement to take meaningful risks early isn't simply motivational language. It reflects an honest, structural reality about how time functions as a safety net, one that gradually narrows with each passing year, regardless of how capable or prepared someone eventually becomes. So if there's a meaningful risk worth considering, a venture worth attempting, a bold decision worth making, and the primary hesitation is simply fear of failure rather than genuine impracticality, it's worth remembering that this fear will likely never feel more affordable to overcome than it does right now, while time itself is still working generously in favor of recovery, however that risk happens to unfold. Let's finish with a truth that deserves far more honest attention than it typically receives. The idea that skipping something simply leaves an empty, neutral space, waiting patiently until you're ready to eventually address it. This feels intuitively true, and it's part of why procrastination and avoidance feel so harmless in the moment. If nothing gets built, the assumption goes, then nothing has really been lost. The space remains open, available, unchanged, ready for whenever you finally decide to fill it. But this assumption is wrong, and understanding why it's wrong reveals something important about what actually happens when meaningful skill building gets consistently postponed. Unbuilt skill doesn't create a neutral gap. It creates a vacuum, and vacuums, whether in physics or in personal development, rarely remain empty for long. Something inevitably moves in to fill that space, and what moves in is almost never neutral either. It's usually frustration, watching others accomplish what could have been accomplished if the skill had been built earlier. It's comparison, measuring your own unrealized potential against someone else's realized version of it. Feeling the gap widen with each passing year, the skill remains unbuilt. And eventually, if the pattern continues long enough, it becomes regret. Quiet, persistent regret about time that has already passed and cannot be reclaimed, regardless of how much motivation eventually shows up afterward. This is precisely why skill building deserves urgency, even when there's no immediate external pressure forcing the issue. It's easy to convince yourself that skipping a particular skill today carries no real cost, simply because nothing dramatic happens in the immediate aftermath of that decision. Life continues normally, nothing collapses. The absence of the skill doesn't announce itself loudly in the short term, but that absence is quietly accumulating in the background, compounding in the opposite direction of growth, until enough time has passed that the gap becomes difficult to ignore. And by then, the emotional cost of that gap has often grown considerably larger than the original discomfort of simply building the skill would have been. Consider how this plays out practically. Someone avoids developing financial literacy for years, telling themselves there will be time later to learn it properly. In the short term, nothing dramatic happens. Bills get paid, life continues. But years later, watching others build genuine financial security through knowledge and habits that could have been developed at any point, the absence of that skill no longer feels neutral. It feels like a source of real frustration, real comparison, sometimes genuine regret about how much easier the current situation might have been had that skill been prioritized earlier. The gap wasn't harmless the entire time it sat unaddressed. It was simply quiet, patiently accumulating consequences that eventually became impossible to ignore. This same pattern applies to nearly every skill worth building. The communication skill left undeveloped doesn't simply remain a neutral absence. It becomes a source of frustration every time an opportunity is lost because the right words couldn't be found under pressure. The physical discipline left unbuilt doesn't remain neutral either. It becomes a source of regret every time declining health limits what could have otherwise been possible. In every case, what wasn't built doesn't wait patiently in some blank, harmless space. It transforms, gradually but consistently, into something considerably heavier to carry. This is why the discipline required to build meaningful skills, especially during years when there's no obvious urgency forcing the decision, matters more than it initially appears to. The absence of pressure today doesn't mean the absence of consequence tomorrow. It simply means the consequence hasn't fully revealed itself yet, patiently waiting somewhere further down the timeline, ready to arrive exactly when it's least convenient to address. So the real question worth asking isn't whether skipping a particular skill feels costly right now, in this immediate moment. It rarely does. The question worth asking is what that unbuilt skill will likely be replaced by several years from now, once the window for building it easily has quietly narrowed. Because nothing valuable simply waits in neutral, empty space forever. Eventually, something fills that space. And far too often, what fills it is exactly the kind of quiet regret that could have been avoided entirely had the decision to build been made years earlier, while the opportunity to do so still felt easy enough to take seriously. If you've ever felt behind, wondering if it's already too late to build the life you want, if turning 35 feels like a countdown instead of a milestone, comment "still time" right now, so I know you're ready to start building instead of worrying. Because the next 5 skills are the ones that quietly separate who thrives later from who doesn't.